It is less than 3 weeks until Election Day, and both campaigns are making their final push to voters across the country. Both campaigns and candidates are heading to swing states across the U.S. and taking part in their own media blitzes in an effort to reach more voters. Here to go on the record is Scott Tranter, Director of Data Science from Decision Desk HQ. Scott, as always, it's great to see you. I want to start first with the Vice President. Kamala Harris is continuing her own media blitz leading up to the election. She's appearing on Fox News, and there's a possibility of her appearing on Joe Rogan's own podcast. You know, Scott, both of these shows appeal to different audiences. Many would say very broad audiences. But, you know, will either of these appearances or potential appearance for the Rogan show move the needle for her at all?
I think it's a good thing, right? The most people who watch these podcasts, they're not watching CNN, MSNBC, or the other major networks 4 or 5 hours a day, which is where a lot of these interviews, you know, the major news networks have occurred. So move the needle remains to be seen. We got a few weeks to go, and so we'll see it. But I think this is a good move by her to get in front of some voters who are spending very little time thinking about the election.
I want to move over to the Trump campaign now, and we've looked at a number of different polls, and we've seen that really over the past 10 days or so, Trump has seen a slight bump in the Rust Belt states, also known as the Blue Wall states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. So, Scott, does the Decision Desk HQ average or forecast match those findings?
Yeah, over the last 2 weeks, we've seen her chances of winning go from about 54-55 to about 50-51% this week. It fluctuates based on some polls and some fundraising we're getting in, but that is some significant movement considering that basically the biggest movement we've had in our forecast all year long is when Joe Biden dropped out. And so this is some momentum for Donald Trump as he goes into early voting and absentee voting, and as we nail down the stretch. But I want to caution, it's some slight movement towards Donald Trump, but no one should be surprised if Donald Trump wins or loses or Harris wins or loses. The forecast is right down the middle right now.
Yeah, it seems to be truly 50-50 across the board. So speaking of the Blue Wall and Michigan in particular, Michigan is home to one of the highest percentages of Arab Americans in the United States. You know, we know that Kamala Harris has faced some pushback, particularly from progressive wings of the party, and also Arab Americans for her role in the Biden administration and the administration's handling of the war in Gaza and the Middle East. So, Scott, does her handling of that war, the conflict, and her position as vice president, being so close to President Biden, impact her chances at all in Michigan, particularly with Arab American voters?
Yeah, so 2 things on that. It doesn't impact a large amount of voters, but Michigan is razor thin, and Michigan may be won by a small amount of voters. And so that's why I think this contingency is important. There's also some adjacent contingencies, not just Arab Americans, but how the Israel-Palestine issue has been handled by the administration is important to voters 18 to 25, specifically Democratic voters. Again, which aren't a big segment, but they could be big enough to make a difference in a state that's probably going to be decided by tens of thousands of votes.
So over on the Trump campaign, he went to Atlanta this week and campaigned in Atlanta and campaigned on the economy. Wanted to get the sense of what the latest DDHQ forecasting is out of Georgia.
Yeah, so look, Donald Trump has shored up a little bit some of the ground he gave up to VP Harris over the last month. He's still favored to win ever so slightly. That's about a point and a half in the average on the forecast probability. He's in the low 60s in terms of probability to win. Again, the momentum has been slightly in his favor over the last couple of weeks. Georgia historically is a Republican state. It's a state that Joe Biden surprisingly won in 2020. So that's why it's so close, but that's why both candidates are spending both a lot of money and a lot of time there.
So sticking with the Sun Belt, but moving west to Arizona, Kamala Harris is seeking to appeal to Republican voters in a new ad. We know that Arizona, often considered a swing state, it's home to, a group of Republican voters that were very strongly supportive of the late Senator John McCain. Scott, I'm curious, where does this group of voters go? I mean, is it possible for Harris to get some momentum with these Republicans from McCain's wing of the GOP?
It's something that even moderate Republicans try to get, that the McCain wing in the GOP primary this year. I'm not convinced that Harris has the winning message to get them over if Nikki Haley couldn't make it happen in the GOP primary. But again, if she's able to switch 10, 15, 20,000 voters in a state like Arizona on something like this, a state that, again, will probably be decided by tens of thousands of votes, it's worth a try. And she's got way too much money and can spend it on things like this to try and eke out 5, 10, 15,000 votes here or there.
So in North Carolina, we know that former President Trump has made a number of false statements about the federal government, FEMA's response to Hurricane Helene. And like I said, this particular is taking place in North Carolina, very hard hit by that storm. Are we seeing this having any impact on the polling coming out of the state?
Yeah, look, it's the polling has, specifically North Carolina and in Florida, has shifted a little bit back towards Donald Trump, post all these hurricanes. We haven't seen any of the effect in the absentee and early voting yet in North Carolina or Florida that would pretend that these types of things and the situation in and around FEMA and support, post-hurricane support, is having an effect. But both campaigns are addressing it both on the stump and in various interviews. So I would say they've probably got some internally polling that says we've got to address this if you're VP Harris, and Donald Trump uses it as a line of attack so that he can try to gain some voters. Ask me again next week. We'll have a big update out of Western North Carolina where all those hard-hitting counties were hit by the hurricane, and see if there was any effect at all. That'll be a good data point for us to look at.
I will definitely make a note of that. I want to go to the Harris campaign right now, or go back to the Harris campaign, because the vice president has brought out former Presidents Obama and Clinton right onto the campaign trail. Look, Scott, we know that these are very popular figures within the Democratic Party, particularly President Obama. But look, it's been nearly 10 years since Obama has been in office, over 20 years since Clinton has been in office. So how much star power do these two former presidents actually have? And is it enough to boost Harris over the finish line?
I don't know how much star power they have. I mean, Clinton, whoa, that was like 30 years ago, right? Barack Obama, when you say 10 years, wow, I'm getting old. Look, they're good for fundraising, and fundraising is good to get voters out there. I don't necessarily think either of those are moving any swayable voters. They might be able to shore up some of the Democrats who are upset with Harris on some of the Israel-Palestine stuff. If they go to Michigan and help there. But I don't know that they're going to move any big votes. They're there mostly for fundraising and mostly because good photo ops. And again, mostly you can only put you only can put so many people on stage, and so might as well take some former presidents.
And President Obama made a lot of news, or a particular piece of news last week when he was in Pittsburgh campaigning for Kamala Harris, and he made a very stern appeal to black men in particular, saying he essentially caught wind of a lack of enthusiasm for her among the voting bloc. Scott, why is Kamala Harris struggling with this demographic?
Yeah, no, that is going to be one of the questions we look at the 2024 election afterwards, because it looks like Donald Trump might be able to get a historically high 15, 20% of the African-American vote, and it's going to be largely driven by his support among African-American men, specifically in the 18 to 35 cohort. Now, I know I'm drilling down there a lot, and look, Harris is going to win the African-American vote outright by a lot, but Donald Trump and the GOP is going to make some inroads. I think it has a lot to do with a lot of Trump's position on taxes, cryptocurrency, some of these issues in around finances and income and business ownership, things like that are appealing. And then we see VP Harris issuing policy statements in the last week or so specifically addressing that. So, it's an interesting segment to watch. It could make the difference in a state like North Carolina and Georgia as well.
In addition to his campaigning across the battleground states this week, Trump was actually in Chicago, where he clashed with the editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News over tariffs during an economic forum. We know that many economists have said that Trump's economic plan could raise prices for Americans because of those tariffs, but we've seen that his base has really appreciated and supported the America First agenda, and much of that involves tariffs. And when we talk about the economy, so Scott, are tariffs ultimately a liability for Trump with these swing voters who are concerned about the economy, but maybe don't want to see higher prices?
We're watching a live test of that now, because the Harris campaign spending money on commercials going exactly after that, saying that the Trump tariffs are going to increase costs and be worse than inflation. And I understand that is the school of thought. That is the classical economic school of thought on that. There's lots of minted PhDs to prove all that. But there is a segment of Donald Trump voters who just don't believe that. They say, hey, that's the policy that got us here. We need to try something else. And also there's the whole aspect of Donald Trump uses tariffs as an attack mechanism, right? It's go after China, go after some of these people and make America stronger. So it's not so much about the tariffs, it's more about the strong man and I'm doing something about the economy, I'm doing something about American jobs that I think people like. And look, it's an issue that 20 years ago, both the Democratic and Republican presidential candidate would be on the same page on this, but this is one of those where they're just not, and it's creating some interesting divides among the electorate.
Certainly it is. Look, early voting numbers are already starting to come in, and we are seeing Republican numbers higher in some places than in years past. We know that recently Democrats have been more likely to vote early and by mail, but ever since 2020, Republicans have made that a major focus, I should say, since after the 2020 election. Ironic because we know that the former president during that election was speaking out against those voting techniques, but has now embraced them. Scott, is there any way for Democrats to close this gap in these areas where we're seeing it narrow?
Yeah, I think the best way to close the gap is we need more days early voting. We're still early. Look, right now, my best guess is we think there's going to be about 140, 145 million total turnout nationwide. Our current model and estimate says that about 70 million of those people will vote early. We're only about 3 to 4 million people nationwide have voted early already. And so any sort of lead or deficiency you see among the parties in some of these states, we're just way too early to make an assessment. What I do know is more Republicans are choosing to vote early because that's what the RNC and Donald Trump himself has pushed. And when we look at who has returned, we're looking at people who have returned ballots who normally would vote on Election Day. And so what we're really looking for is people returning ballots who haven't voted before, because that means that Donald Trump or Harris is expanding their base and getting new voters to the polls. Right now, we're just seeing people who would normally vote on Election Day voting early. But we still got tens of millions of early votes to go and a lot of trends to follow. Again, by this time next week, I bet we're going to have 10 to 15 million people voted early, and we'll be able to kind of read the tea leaves a little bit more with more data like that.
Yeah, yep, it's certainly changing every day, and I'm sure it'll be a horse race when it comes to early voting as well. Scott Tranter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
And that's it for What's America Thinking. I'm Julia Manchester. Come back next week. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel.